Hi, my name is Christopher Scott from the Biblical Leadership blog at christopherscottblog.com, and today I'm giving you a brief description and helps about how to keep your best volunteers by creating a positive culture for your volunteers in your nonprofit organization or church. So let's get started today. I'm going to give you 7 basic things that you can do to keep your best volunteers by creating a great culture. So the first thing we need to do is define, what does culture mean? What does culture look like in your organization? The definition that I use for culture is that culture is a current state of affairs relating to the appreciation and use of volunteers at your organization. Okay? It's a current state of affairs relating to the appreciation and use of volunteers at your organization. A couple other definitions of culture by Aubrey Malphurs in his book, Look Before You Lead. He says, everyone lives in and thus has a culture, and none of us can separate ourselves from that culture. We are part of it, and it is part of us. In Edgar Schein's book, Organizational Culture and Leadership, the 4th edition, he writes, culture is both a here and now dynamic phenomenon and a coercive background structure that influences us in multiple ways. Culture is constantly reenacted and created by our interactions with others and shaped by our own behavior, right? So culture is basically kind of the environment that people work in. And if you're a employee in a church or a nonprofit, the culture that you cultivate and send your volunteers into is very, very important. And today I'm going to give you 7 basic ways to improve the culture of your organization in order to keep the best volunteers that you have. So the first thing you need to do to improve your culture is remember that, number 1, you are responsible. No one else is responsible for the experience of your volunteers except for you. You're the one that recruits the volunteers, you're the one that places them in their positions, so you are therefore responsible for the culture that you're sending your volunteers in. Okay? Number 2, you want to show the value that volunteers bring to your nonprofit organization. Okay? So when I teach workshops, or when I've taught workshops for the Center for Nonprofit Management in Dallas and Fort Worth, I always do an exercise where I show people how to quantify their volunteer program, basically taking the number of volunteers they have, using a percentage and then an hourly wage, and then showing them how much money volunteers save their nonprofit organization. And there's some easy ways you can do that online and research it. So you're going to want to do that. Quantify your volunteer program, show how much money your organization or church is saving by using volunteers, and then use that information to show to your volunteers, to show to staff, to show to leadership at your organization, to show to your board, anyone that you can get to see it, as a way to show them that volunteers are important and that volunteers support your work, and that you couldn't do your work without volunteers, or if you did try to do it, it'd be a lot more expensive. Okay? So first thing you need to remember to create a great culture for your volunteers is that you are responsible. That's number 1. Number 2 is you want to quantify your volunteer program. Number 3, you're going to want to create social interaction among volunteers. Okay? Why create social interaction? One reason is that volunteers like it, right? So research shows that one of the requests that volunteers have is they don't want to just be put in a room, in a dark room, locked by themselves doing work. They want to be at least with clients, or they want to be with other volunteers doing work and serving people, right? So you want to create social interaction among your volunteers. Another reason you want to do that is it helps keep the passion of volunteers going. So if you have volunteers matched with other volunteers, they can start to share stories with each other about people they've served, clients they've helped, how this work is making a difference in the community, how this volunteering is helping them personally, and it's a way to keep the passion of your volunteers up and going. Another reason you want to create social interaction among volunteers is that it transfers the passion, that's what I just said. It transfers the values of your organization. So if you have a new volunteer set up with an older volunteer, it allows that older volunteer to kind of mentor and coach the newer volunteer about the values of the organization and what the organization stands for. Fourth thing you want to do to create a great culture for your volunteers is you want to have fun. Okay? Pretty much everybody wants to have fun. So try to pair them with friends if they came to volunteer with friends. Pair them with their family. Pair them with other people in their age group that they can relate to and have fun with. Make sure that they have fun, okay? All things being equal in the world of recruiting volunteers and keeping volunteers, the volunteer opportunity and the volunteer activity that volunteers do that is the most fun is the one volunteers are going to keep doing the longest. So if you want to keep your best volunteers, you need to make sure that it's fun, okay? And there's just lots of ideas out there you can do for fun. I always tried to play music. I tried to put people with their family and friends. I tried to have food there. I tried to mix up the activities so they didn't always do the same activity, but try to give them different roles to keep them excited. So you want to make sure that they have fun. The fifth thing you're going to want to do to create a great culture, and this one is really important, is you want to collaborate with other staff on your volunteer management program. Which sounds a little contradictory because you're the one in charge of recruiting volunteers, you're the one in charge of keeping your best volunteers, but if you want to create a great culture for your volunteers, you need to collaborate with other staff, specifically the staff that also work with volunteers. So ask that staff, how do you need volunteers? How can we better manage the volunteers that you work with? What are some ideas you have for improving the work that volunteers do? And in doing that, you're going to get buy-in from the staff that work with volunteers. And as a result, they're going to want to work with those volunteers, treat them better, and express appreciation of those volunteers because the staff has had input into the volunteer process and what goes on. And I think that kind of stems from the idea that naturally, as Americans, we usually reject things that aren't our idea. So if you can bring staff in and allow them to kind of speak their voice and share some ideas, it's going to help them better like the volunteer management program and therefore going to improve the culture that volunteers are going into and serving in. Okay? The sixth thing you're going to want to do is train staff about how to work with volunteers. Okay? So you are responsible, let's say, to recruit volunteers and place them, but you might not manage every single volunteer at your organization. You're going to have other staff that are in charge of volunteering or managing those volunteers. So if you can, train them, whether it's just you giving them a little coaching about how to work with volunteers. Maybe you share some articles with them or find some free podcasts you can send to that staff. Or if you can get the finances to send that staff to a conference or get them on a webinar that trains them how to work with volunteers, that's very important because research shows that nonprofits that don't provide training to staff about how to work with volunteers usually have the most difficulty keeping those volunteers. Okay, big surprise there, I know. And the seventh thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get support from leadership, okay? You want to get buy-in and get support from leadership for your nonprofit organization's volunteer program, okay? So this helps with recruiting, training, coordinating, things like that. And how do you get support? Number one, you're going to want to quantify your volunteer program, like you said. Number two, you want to tell any stories that you can about how volunteers have served your organization. And you want to continually feed that information to your management and your board about the value volunteers are bringing. And in doing that, volunteers are going to be seen as valuable. You're going to get a little bit more finances for your volunteers to provide thank you events or resources for volunteers to help them in their work. And it's going to help your volunteer program succeed. I remember when I was working at the United Way, and we had a volunteer center at our United Way where the people that worked in the volunteer center would recruit volunteers and then refer them out to organizations in the community. And there were some conversations about eliminating the volunteer center from our United Way because we weren't really, I shouldn't say we, the board wasn't really sure if it was a necessary expense, right, to pay the salaries of 3 people to recruit volunteers and then refer them out to other organizations. So when some of those conversations started to come up, the ladies that worked in our volunteer center did a little research, right? So they started to track how many volunteers do we refer specifically to the county departments, right? Animal services, drug and rehab places, parks and recreation, things like that. How many volunteers does our local United Way Volunteer Center recruit and refer to county departments? And then they figured out what was the average number of hours that those volunteers volunteered per year. And then they did a little research about what the hourly wage would be, just the bottom wage, for a county employee to do that same work, right? And so they started to do that math and calculate those statistics and then provide that data to our board every month saying we just saved our county $230,000 this month by the services that we provided, right? So they started to really put a number behind the things that they were doing. And that really made the difference, and the United Way kept the Volunteer Center if that's proof that it worked. So these are 7 basic things that you can do to keep your best volunteers by creating a great culture. Number 1 is remember that you're responsible for your culture. Number 2, you're going to want to show the value that volunteers bring to your nonprofit organization. Number 3, you want to create time for social interaction among volunteers when they work and serve together. Number 4, you're going to want to have fun, okay? Help volunteers have fun. Number 5, you want to collaborate with other staff about how to manage your volunteers and how to best keep your volunteers. Number 6, you want to train staff on how to work with volunteers. And number 7, you want to get support from leadership for your volunteers, for your volunteer program as a way to keep them. So my name is Christopher Scott from the Biblical Leadership blog at ChristopherScottBlog.com. I appreciate you tuning in and watching as I got to share with you 7 tips, 7 things you can do to keep your best volunteers by creating a great culture. Thanks for tuning in.